In a world where hope flickers like a dying flame, a father and daughter face an unimaginable trial. David's desperate plea for help leads them to a clinic where they're met with indifference, yet his unwavering love for his sick daughter, Lily, drives him to fight for her survival against all odds. But when the authorities step in and a risky, experimental treatment becomes their last hope, will David's decision be the miracle that saves his daughter or the heartbreak that shatters their world? The wind howled through the narrow streets, its icy fingers seeking every crack and crevice to chill. Night had settled in, heavy and oppressive, as if darkness itself were pressing down on the world. In this bleak setting, a man trudged forward, his steps uneven, breath ragged. Beside him, a small girl clung to his hand, her frail body shivering under a threadbare coat. Her wide, glassy eyes darted around, expecting something to leap from the shadows. They approached a modest clinic, its lights casting a warm glow on the cold pavement. The man hesitated, scanning the building, hoping they wouldn't be turned away. Tightening his grip on the girl's hand, he took a deep breath. With steely resolve, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The clinic's warmth contrasted with the biting cold outside. The faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something vaguely medicinal. The waiting room held a few people, each lost in thought, while tired-looking nurses moved behind the reception desk, their expressions detached. The man led his daughter to the desk, his exhaustion visible in every step. His clothes, once decent, were now frayed and faded, hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. His face shadowed with days-old stubble, and his sharp eyes bore the burden of a man who had seen too much. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The receptionist didn't look up. He tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me, ma'am." The receptionist finally glanced up, quickly assessing the man. She sighed softly, acknowledging his presence. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice flat, void of warmth. "No," the man replied, swallowing hard. "We don't. Please, I need someone to look at my daughter. She's very sick." The receptionist's gaze flicked to the girl, who stood silently beside her father, trembling slightly. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes dark and sunken. The receptionist's expression didn't change, but a brief flash of something, perhaps pity, or maybe annoyance, crossed her features. "Do you have insurance?" she asked, her tone no different than before. The man shook his head. "No. We don't have insurance. We don't have anything." His voice broke slightly. "But please, she's all I have left. I just need someone to help her." The receptionist stared at him for a moment, then her gaze returned to the computer screen. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't treat her without insurance. You'll need to go to the free clinic downtown." "There's no time," the man said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, she's getting worse every day. They said this place could help." The receptionist paused, her fingers stopping on the keyboard. She looked at the girl again, this time with a more critical eye, noting the shallow breaths and the translucent quality of her skin. The receptionist's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd seen similar cases before, and the outcomes were rarely good. With a sigh, she reached for the phone. "I'm going to have to call someone," she said, her voice tight. "You can't just show up like this. We need to follow protocol." The man's face drained of what little color it had. "Call who?" he asked, panic lacing his words. "The authorities," she said simply, lifting the receiver to her ear. "They'll know what to do." "No, please," the man begged, stepping closer. "I'm not asking for charity. I just need help. Please, you don't understand," but the receptionist was already speaking into the phone, her voice low, her eyes avoiding the man's pleading gaze. The man turned to his daughter, who was swaying on her feet, her eyes half closed. He knelt beside her, trembling as he brushed a few strands of hair away from her face. "It's going to be okay, Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's going to be okay. Just hold on a little longer, sweetheart." Lily's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at her father with a tired, distant expression. "I'm so cold, Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely audible. So cold, tears welled up in the man's eyes, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I know, baby. But it's going to be all right. I promise." He stayed there, kneeling on the cold tile floor, holding his daughter close, as if his embrace could shield her from the world's cruelty. The sound of footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, and the man looked up to see two uniformed officers entering the clinic. Their faces were stern, their eyes scanning the room before landing on him. "Is this the man?" one of the officers asked the receptionist, his voice low and authoritative. She nodded, setting the phone down. "That's him. He says the girl is sick, but they don't have insurance. I told him to go to the free clinic, but..." The officer raised a hand, silencing her. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man and the child in his arms. There was a moment of silence, a brief pause in the room's rhythm, as if the world itself were holding its breath. "What's your name?" the officer asked, his tone softer now, though still edged with caution. The man swallowed hard, his throat dry. "David," he replied. "My name is David. This is my daughter, Lily. Please, officer, she's very sick. I don't know what else to do." The officer glanced at his partner, who gave a small nod, then turned his attention back to David. "All right, David. Let's take a look at her." He crouched beside the girl, his voice gentle as he spoke to her. "Hi there, Lily. Can you tell me what's wrong?" Lily blinked slowly, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Her father squeezed her hand, and she finally managed to whisper, "I'm so tired." The officer frowned, a deep line creasing his forehead. He exchanged another look with his partner, who had been watching with an unreadable expression. Finally, the officer stood and turned to the receptionist. "Call for a doctor," he said firmly. "Now." The receptionist hesitated, her eyes widening in surprise. "But..." "I already told them, now," the officer repeated, leaving no room for argument. The receptionist hurried to comply, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number. The officer turned back to David, his expression softening. "We're going to get her some help," he said quietly. "Just hang in there." David nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks as he clung to his daughter. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you." The officer didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. This was just the beginning. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights filled the clinic's waiting room, mingling with the distant sound of muffled voices and the soft tapping of keyboards. Time stretched, each second dragging as David clutched Lily's frail hand. The officers stood nearby, their presence both reassuring and intimidating, their expressions locked in professional detachment. David felt the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He kept his gaze fixed on his daughter, willing her to fight a little longer. The door to the back hallway creaked open, and an older doctor in a white coat emerged, his face lined with years of experience. He approached slowly, his eyes moving from David to Lily and then to the officers. A silent understanding passed between the doctor and the authorities. "Mr. Davis?" the doctor asked, his voice calm and measured. David looked up, nodding quickly. "Yes, I'm David. This is my daughter, Lily. Please, she's really sick. I don't know what's wrong with her, but it's getting worse every day." The doctor nodded, crouching to Lily's level, his gaze softening as he studied her pale face. "Hi, Lily," he said gently. "My name is Dr. Thompson. I'm here to help you, okay? Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Lily blinked, her eyes heavy and unfocused. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a weak, breathless sigh. Dr. Thompson frowned, concern deepening as he touched her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin was alarming, and he could feel her rapid, uneven pulse. "We need to get her into an exam room right away," Dr. Thompson said, standing and motioning for a nurse. "She's burning up." We'll need to run some tests. A young nurse hurried over with a wheelchair. David hesitated, his heart pounding as he watched them lift Lily into the chair. She looked so small, so fragile, her head lolling to the side as if even holding it up was too much. "You're going to be okay, Lily," David whispered, his voice trembling. "Just hang on, sweetheart. They're going to make you better." The nurse began to wheel Lily towards the back hallway, Dr. Thompson following closely. One of the officers stepped forward, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "Come with us, Mr. Davis. We need to ask you a few questions while they take care of your daughter." David nodded numbly, his feet moving on autopilot as the officer guided him to a small, quiet room off to the side of the waiting area. The second officer followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The room was sparsely furnished, just a table and a few chairs, the walls bare and unwelcoming. David sank into one of the chairs, his hands trembling as he laced his fingers together in his lap. The younger officer, who had been kind to Lily, pulled out a chair and sat down across from David. He introduced himself as Officer Reynolds, his tone calm but firm, as if balancing authority with empathy. His partner, Officer Green, remained standing by the door, arms crossed, eyes fixed on David. "Mr. Davis," Officer Reynolds began, his voice measured, "we understand that you're going through a difficult time. Our priority is to make sure your daughter gets the care she needs, but we also need to understand what led you to bring her here tonight." David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We've been to so many places," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Doctors, clinics, hospitals, but no one could figure out what was wrong with her. Every time we thought we were getting somewhere, it just got worse. We heard about this clinic, that they might be able to help people like us, people who have nowhere else to turn." Officer Reynolds nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And when did you first notice that Lily was sick?" David swallowed hard, memories rushing back like a flood. "It started about 6 months ago. She had a fever, nothing too serious at first. We thought it was just a cold, maybe the flu. But the fever wouldn't go away. It just kept coming back, stronger each time. Then she started getting these headaches, so bad that she couldn't even get out of bed. She'd cry at night, telling me how much it hurt, and I didn't know what to do." His voice broke, and he covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Officer Reynolds waited, giving him a moment to compose himself before continuing. "You said you've been to other doctors. What did they say? Did they give you any diagnosis?" David shook his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "They ran tests, so many tests. But they never found anything. One doctor thought it might be some kind of rare infection, another said it could be neurological, but nothing fit. They gave us medications, treatments, but nothing worked. And now she's so weak. I'm afraid I'm losing her." Officer Reynolds exchanged a glance with Officer Green, who still hadn't spoken. The weight of the situation was clear in their expressions. This wasn't just a case of a desperate father, there was something more here, something that neither of them fully understood yet. Before Officer Reynolds could ask another question, the door to the room opened, and Dr. Thompson stepped in. His face was serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes as he addressed David. "Mr. Davis," he said, "we've started running some preliminary tests on Lily. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her, but I need to ask you a few more questions about her medical history. Has she been exposed to anything unusual? Any travel, any contact with someone who was sick?" David shook his head again, his mind racing. "No, nothing like that. We haven't traveled anywhere, and she's been with me the whole time. We've just been trying to get by, moving from place to place when we could. I've tried to keep her safe, but," Dr. Thompson nodded, though his concern deepened. "We'll need to keep her here for observation, at least overnight. We're going to do everything we can, but I have to be honest with you, Mr. Davis, her condition is critical. We'll need to bring in some specialists to get a clearer picture of what's going on." David's heart sank, but he nodded, grateful for any chance, no matter how slim. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for helping her." Dr. Thompson gave a brief, tight smile, then turned to the officers. "I'm going to stay with her for now. I'll update you as soon as we know more." As the doctor left the room, Officer Green finally spoke, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We'll need to contact Child Protective Services. It's standard procedure in cases like this." David's blood ran cold at the mention of CPS. "No, please," he begged, his voice breaking again. "She's all I have. I've been trying to take care of her, but it's been so hard. I just need a little more time, just until she's better." Officer Reynolds leaned forward, his expression softening. "We're not here to take her away from you, David. But we have to make sure she's safe, that she's getting the care she needs. If everything checks out, you'll be able to stay with her." David nodded slowly, though the fear still gnawed at his insides. He couldn't lose her, not now, not after everything they'd been through. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I'll do whatever it takes. Just, please, don't take her from me." The officers exchanged another glance, and Officer Reynolds gave a slight nod. "Let's focus on getting her the help she needs first. We'll figure the rest out later." David managed a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you," he said again, the words feeling woefully inadequate for the gratitude he felt. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. David's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, hope, and exhaustion, each emotion pulling him in a different direction. He had no choice but to trust these strangers with the most precious thing in his life, praying that, somehow, they would be able to save his daughter. And so, he waited, the minutes stretching into hours, the weight of the world pressing down on him as he sat in that small, cold room, hoping against hope that this time, they would find the answers they so desperately needed. The hours crept by, each second a drawn-out eternity as David waited in the stark, sterile room. The white walls, bare and clinical, seemed to close in on him, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of paper or the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. His thoughts swirled in an endless loop of fear and uncertainty, every possibility, both hopeful and dire, playing out in his mind. He felt trapped, powerless to do anything but wait and hope that somewhere behind those closed doors, the doctors were finding a way to save his daughter. At last, the door creaked open, and Dr. Thompson stepped into the room. His face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes held a glimmer of determination. David immediately sat up, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched the doctor's face for any sign of good news. "Mr. Davis," Dr. Thompson began, his voice steady but grave, "we've done some preliminary tests on Lily. There's no easy way to say this, but her condition is extremely serious. We're dealing with something unusual, something we haven't encountered before." David's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? What's wrong with her?" Dr. Thompson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Lily's symptoms suggest a severe systemic issue, possibly a rare metabolic disorder. But there are inconsistencies, things that don't quite add up. Her blood work, for instance, shows abnormalities we can't fully explain. Her immune system is severely compromised, but not in a way we typically see with autoimmune diseases. And then there's the fever. It's persistently high, despite everything we've tried. Her body is fighting something, but we don't know what." David felt a cold chill run down his spine. But there's something you can do, right? You can help her?" Dr. Thompson nodded slowly. "We're going to do everything we can. I've already contacted some specialists, people who might have more experience with cases like Lily's. They'll be here as soon as possible. In the meantime, we'll keep her stable, but I have to be honest with you, David. This is beyond anything we've dealt with here at this clinic." David's heart sank as he absorbed the doctor's words. He had come to this clinic as a last hope, believing that if they could just get here, everything would be okay. But now, it seemed like even the best doctors were at a loss. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We're going to move Lily to a more advanced care facility, Dr. Thompson explained. They'll have the resources to run more detailed tests and hopefully get to the bottom of what's happening. It's important that we do this quickly, every minute counts. David nodded numbly, feeling a strange detachment as if he were watching the scene unfold from outside his own body. It all seemed so surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Can I see her? Before you move her? Of course, Dr. Thompson said gently. I'll take you to her now. David stood shakily, following the doctor down the narrow hallway. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glare, and the smell of antiseptic grew stronger as they approached the ICU. Dr. Thompson pushed open a door, revealing a small room filled with beeping monitors and medical equipment. Lily lay in the bed, her tiny frame dwarfed by the crisp white sheets and the machines that surrounded her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. David's throat tightened at the sight of her. She looked so fragile, so impossibly small, as if the weight of the world was crushing her. He moved to her side, gently taking her hand in his, careful not to disturb the line running into her arm. Hey, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice breaking as he tried to hold back the tears. I'm here. Daddy's right here. Lily's eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head slightly to look at him. There was a faint smile on her lips, though it was weak and tinged with pain. Daddy, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm tired, I know, baby, David replied, his heart aching with every word. I know you are. But you've got to stay strong, okay? The doctors are going to help you. We're going to get you better. Lily nodded slightly, her eyelids drooping as she struggled to stay awake. Will you stay with me? She asked, her voice so small, so fragile. Of course, sweetheart, David said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not going anywhere. As he sat beside her, holding her hand, time seemed to blur. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the soft hum of the machines became a lullaby, lulling Lily into a fitful sleep. David watched her, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of her face, every feature so familiar yet now marked by the strain of her illness. He couldn't help but think back to when she was younger, so full of life and energy, always running around with that bright, infectious laugh. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different world. Dr. Thompson re-entered the room quietly, his expression serious but compassionate. Mr. Davis, the ambulance is ready to take Lily to the new facility. They're expecting her, and everything is prepared for her arrival. David nodded, reluctant to let go of Lily's hand, even for a moment. I'll ride with her, he said firmly. Of course, Dr. Thompson agreed. We'll make sure she's comfortable during the transfer. The next moments were a blur of activity as nurses moved quickly to prepare Lily for transport. David stayed close, his eyes never leaving his daughter, his heart pounding with anxiety. When they finally wheeled her out of the room, he followed close behind, his legs feeling heavy, as if each step took all his remaining strength. Outside, the night was deep, the sky a velvety black speckled with stars that seemed distant and cold. The ambulance waited, its lights flashing in the darkness, casting an eerie glow on the clinic's facade. As they loaded Lily into the back, David climbed in beside her, settling into the seat next to the gurney. The paramedics were quiet, their movements efficient and practiced, but David barely noticed them. His entire focus was on Lily, on the rise and fall of her chest, the faint pulse in her wrist. The doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. The ambulance began to move, the gentle sway of the vehicle almost soothing. David reached out and touched Lily's hand, her skin cool against his. She didn't stir, her breathing shallow and uneven. David swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to be strong for her. She needed him now more than ever. The ride seemed to stretch on forever, the minutes dragging by as they wound through the city streets. David's thoughts were a chaotic jumble, memories of better times mingling with the stark reality of the present. He tried to picture a future where Lily was healthy again, running and playing like she used to, her laughter filling the air. But the image was hazy, distant, as if it were slipping further out of reach with each passing moment. Finally, the ambulance pulled up to the new facility, a larger, more imposing building with the look of a place where serious work was done. As they unloaded Lily and wheeled her inside, David felt a flicker of hope. Maybe here, in this place with its advanced technology and specialists, they would find the answers that had eluded them for so long. Inside, the lights were brighter, the air filled with the low hum of activity. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose, their faces focused but kind as they took Lily into their care. David followed as far as he was allowed, his heart pounding with every step. At the door to the ICU, a nurse stopped him gently, explaining that they needed to run more tests, that he would have to wait. David wanted to protest, to demand that he stay with her, but he knew it wouldn't help. He nodded reluctantly, letting them take her, feeling a part of himself break as they wheeled her away. He sank into a chair outside the ICU, his head in his hands, overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness. All he could do now was wait and hope that the specialists could do what no one else had been able to. The minutes ticked by, each one an agonizing eternity. David stared at the floor, his mind a blank as exhaustion and fear took their toll. But even in his darkest moments, a small flame of hope burned within him, refusing to be extinguished. He had to believe that they would find a way to save her. He had to believe that this wasn't the end. And so, David waited, clinging to that fragile hope, as the night deepened and the world outside grew still. The cold, hard chair in the waiting room felt like a distant anchor tethering David to the present. He sat there, head in his hands, as the relentless ticking of a wall clock marked the slow passage of time. The sterile, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the pale tiles beneath his feet. Every so often, a nurse or doctor would pass by, their faces blurred with the urgency of their work, but none stopped to offer him the solace or the answers he so desperately sought. He replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his mind, the countless clinics, the endless tests, the helpless look in Lily's eyes as she grew weaker by the hour. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, guilt, and exhaustion, each emotion crashing into the next, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. A door at the end of the hall swung open, and David looked up, his heart leaping into his throat. Dr. Thompson emerged, his expression grave but not without a hint of empathy. He approached slowly, as if carrying the weight of what he was about to say. David's pulse quickened, and he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Mr. Davis," Dr. Thompson began, his voice low and measured, "we've run a series of tests on Lily, and the results are troubling. Her condition is deteriorating rapidly, and we're facing a critical juncture." David felt the world tilt around him. He struggled to find his voice, to form words that could somehow reverse the nightmare he was living. "What does that mean? What can you do for her?" Dr. Thompson took a deep breath, choosing his words with care. "Lily's illness is unlike anything we've encountered before. Her immune system is shutting down, and her organs are starting to fail. We've consulted with specialists, and they believe there might be a chance, a very slim chance, that an experimental treatment could stabilize her." "Experimental?" David repeated, the words sticking in his throat. "What does that mean? Is it safe?" The doctor hesitated, his eyes dark with the burden of his knowledge. "It's a last resort option. The treatment is still in the early stages of development, and there are significant risks involved. But it might be the only way to save her." David felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the decision before him. He had come here hoping for a miracle, but now he was faced with a choice that could either save his daughter or... "What are the risks?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Thompson's expression softened, and he looked down for a moment before meeting David's gaze. "The treatment could cause severe complications. There's a possibility that it might not work at all, or that it could make her condition worse. But without it, Lily's chances of survival are very slim." David's mind raced, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desperation. The idea of putting Lily through something so uncertain, so dangerous, was terrifying. But the thought of losing her, that was unbearable. "Is there no other way?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thompson shook his head slowly. "We've exhausted all conventional options. If we don't act soon, we might lose the window of opportunity to try this treatment." David sank back into the chair, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of it all. How had it come to this? How had they reached a point where the only hope for his daughter's life was a gamble, a leap into the unknown? He looked up at Dr. Thompson, searching for some sign, some guidance in those tired, compassionate eyes. "Will you be with her? Will you make sure she's okay?" David asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'll be with her every step of the way," Dr. Thompson promised, his tone firm, reassuring. "We'll do everything we can to keep her comfortable and safe. You have my word." David nodded slowly, his decision made, though his heart felt as if it were breaking in two. "Okay," he whispered. "Do it. Whatever it takes, do it." Dr. Thompson placed a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture of support and understanding. "We'll begin immediately. I'll keep you updated every step of the way." As Dr. Thompson turned to leave, David called out after him, his voice filled with a sudden urgency. "Wait, can I see her? Before you start?" The doctor paused, then nodded. "Of course. Follow me." David followed Dr. Thompson down the corridor, each step heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. They reached a set of double doors leading to a small, dimly lit room where Lily lay. She was surrounded by monitors and machines, the soft beeping a constant reminder of the fragility of her life. Her face was pale, her skin almost translucent under the harsh lights, and her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. David approached the bed, his heart in his throat. He knelt beside her, gently taking her small, delicate hand in his. Her skin was cool to the touch, and her fingers barely moved in response to his. He swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here." Lily's eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head slightly to look at him. Her gaze was unfocused, clouded by pain and exhaustion, but there was a faint spark of recognition. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. David forced a smile, though his heart was breaking inside. "You're so brave, Lily. You're the bravest little girl I know. And I'm so proud of you." Lily's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, though it was so faint, so fragile. "Tired," she whispered, her eyelids drooping as she struggled to stay awake. "I know, baby," David said, his voice trembling. "I know you are. But you just have to hang on a little longer, okay? The doctors are going to help you get better. They're going to make you all better." Lily nodded slightly, though her eyes were already closing, her small body sinking into the bed as if even the effort of staying awake was too much. David leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, his tears spilling over as he whispered, "I love you, Lily. So much. You're my whole world." He stayed there for a moment longer, his forehead resting against hers, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He knew that this might be the last time he saw her like this, the last time he could hold her, talk to her, tell her how much he loved her. But he had to believe that it wasn't, that they would make it through this, that Lily would be okay. Dr. Thompson gently touched David's shoulder, signaling that it was time. David stood slowly, his hand lingering on Lily's for a moment before he forced himself to let go. He looked down at her one last time, taking in every detail of her face, committing it to memory. "Please, take care of her," he whispered to Dr. Thompson, his voice breaking. "We will," Dr. Thompson replied, his tone filled with quiet determination. "We'll take good care of her, David. You have my word." David nodded, his heart aching as he stepped back, watching as the medical team moved in to begin the procedure. He felt a deep, wrenching pain in his chest, a pain that only grew as he walked out of the room, leaving his daughter behind. He could hear the soft beeping of the machines fading behind him, each step taking him further from her. The door closed with a soft click, sealing him on the other side, alone with his thoughts and fears. He leaned against the wall, his legs threatening to give out beneath him as he tried to hold himself together. The silence of the hallway pressed in around him, the weight of what he had just done settling like a leaden blanket over his heart. He had made the only choice he could, the choice to fight for his daughter's life, no matter the cost. But as he stood there, alone in the sterile, empty corridor, he couldn't shake the fear that haunted him, the fear that he might have just said goodbye to his little girl for the last time. All he could do now was wait. David paced the length of the small waiting room, his steps uneven and restless. The minutes crawled by, each one dragging out longer than the last. The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air, a constant reminder of the place he was in, the place where his daughter was fighting for her life. He tried to focus on the sounds around him, the distant hum of the hospital, the occasional footsteps of nurses passing by, but nothing could drown out the deafening roar of his own thoughts. He had always been a man of faith, believing in the goodness of the world despite the hardships he had faced. But now, in this moment, he found himself questioning everything. How could this happen to Lily? She was so young, so full of life. She didn't deserve this. No child did. And yet here she was, lying in a cold hospital bed, her fate resting in the hands of strangers and an experimental treatment that might not even work. The door to the waiting room creaked open, and David spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Dr. Thompson stepped in, his face drawn and tired, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. David's pulse quickened, and he took a tentative step forward, searching the doctor's face for any sign of hope. "Dr. Thompson," David began, his voice strained with anxiety. "Is she?" Dr. Thompson held up a hand, signaling for David to take a breath. "She's stable," he said gently. "The procedure was difficult, and there were some complications, but Lily is holding on." David felt a rush of relief so intense that his knees nearly buckled. He had prepared himself for the worst, had steeled himself for the possibility that his daughter might not survive the night. But now, hearing that she was stable, that she was still fighting, it was more than he had dared to hope for. "Can I see her?" David asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Dr. Thompson nodded. "She's still very weak, but yes, you can see her. She'll need time to recover, and we're not out of the woods yet, but she's made it through the worst of it." David followed Dr. Thompson down the long, sterile corridor, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The walls seemed to close in on him, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows that danced in his peripheral vision. He tried to keep his thoughts focused, tried to hold on to the hope that had been reignited in his chest, but the fear of what he might find on the other side of the door threatened to overwhelm him. Finally, they reached the ICU. Dr. Thompson pushed open the door, and David stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat at the sight before him. Lily lay in the bed, her small body still surrounded by machines and monitors, but there was a softness to her face now, a peacefulness that hadn't been there before. Her skin, while still pale, had a hint of color, and her breathing, though shallow, was steady. David approached the bed slowly, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless feeling it had before. He let out a shuddering breath, the tears he had been holding back finally spilling over as he knelt beside her, pressing her hand to his lips. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here." Lily's eyelids fluttered, and she slowly opened her eyes, her gaze unfocused but searching. When she saw David, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. David's heart swelled with joy, the sound of her voice like music to his ears. "I'm here, Lily. I'm right here." She blinked slowly, her small hand tightening around his. I had a dream," she murmured, her words slurring slightly as if she were still half asleep. "I was flying, in the sky, with Mommy." David felt a lump form in his throat. "You were flying, sweetheart?" he asked gently, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Lily nodded weakly, her eyelids drooping as she fought to stay awake. It was so pretty, Daddy. Mommy said. She said it wasn't time to come home yet. David swallowed hard, the tears streaming down his cheeks as he listened to his daughter's words. That's right, baby, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's not time yet. You're going to get better, and we're going to go home together. Just you and me. Lily smiled again, a soft, contented smile that made David's heart ache with love. Okay, Daddy, she whispered, her eyes closing as sleep overtook her once more. David stayed by her side, holding her hand and watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The fear that had gripped him so tightly was beginning to loosen its hold, replaced by a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, they had turned a corner. He knew there were still challenges ahead, still a long road to recovery, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that his little girl was going to make it. Hours passed, and the tension in the room began to ease. Nurses came and went, checking Lily's vitals, adjusting her medications, but they did so with a quiet confidence that reassured David. Dr. Thompson returned periodically to check on her, offering David a few encouraging words each time, though he could see the exhaustion in the doctor's eyes. As dawn began to break, casting a soft, golden light through the window, Dr. Thompson returned one last time, this time with a small smile on his face. She's responding well, he said, his voice tinged with relief. Her vitals are stabilizing, and the treatment seems to be working. We're not out of the woods yet, but she's made remarkable progress. David felt as though a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his heart filled with a gratitude so profound he could hardly speak. Thank you, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for saving her. Dr. Thompson shook his head, a humble smile on his lips. Lily's a fighter, he said softly. She's the one who pulled through. We just gave her the tools to do it. David nodded, his eyes welling up with tears once more. He looked down at Lily, her peaceful face, her small hand still nestled in his, and he knew that this was the moment he had been praying for, the moment when hope had finally triumphed over despair. As the sun continued to rise, bathing the room in its warm, golden light, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay. Lily was still here, still fighting, and as long as she was, he would fight right alongside her. The day stretched on, the minutes blending into hours as David remained by Lily's side. He watched as she slept, her breathing steady and strong, and he felt a deep, abiding love for this little girl who had endured so much. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but he also knew that they would face them together. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open once more. She looked up at David, her gaze clear and bright, and she smiled, a smile full of life and promise. Daddy, she whispered, her voice stronger now. I'm hungry. David let out a soft, incredulous laugh, his heart swelling with joy. Hungry, huh, he said, brushing a tear from his cheek. Well, I think we can do something about that. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. We're going to be okay, Lily, he whispered, his voice full of conviction. We're going to be just fine. And as the night settled in, wrapping the world in its quiet embrace, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because in that moment, he realized that the miracle he had been praying for wasn't just about saving Lily's life, it was about rediscovering the strength of their bond, the unbreakable connection between a father and his daughter. And that, more than anything, was the greatest miracle of all.